Well, thank you very much for coming, everyone. My name is Julia Bahadrian, and like we said, I was born in London, and I'm currently studying history and politics in the University of Edinburgh, so quite far up. I specialise in kind of Middle Eastern studies, modern, ancient, and I've recently gained an interest in kind of memory studies. So studying like collective memory, talking about like generational memory and how it's transmitted, which is all stuff that we're going to be talking about. I'd like to really thank everyone for showing up, and also Misak for helping organise everything, Kaya for hosting, and yeah, hopefully this is a subject which will be able to connect with quite a few of you quite deeply. And as I said, there'll be questions at the end where hopefully I can get you to think some more about, Armenian identity, how you talk about it, how you present it, and how you kind of identify it. So this kind of presentation, called Understanding Armenian Identity Through Diaspora, Collective Memory and Generational Trauma, will be split into about 6 sections. So we'll be just going over the brief kind of Armenian story, who are the Armenians, how the Armenian genocide happened, and we'll be talking into 3 stages of how the diasporas are formed and fragmented. We'll be talking about how they're representative of certain artistic values within the community and how narratives are built around the diaspora. And we're talking about how it's mobilized and its role and the role of individual Armenians within the greater diaspora. And we're talking about new identities and Artsakh, and talk about how that's helped influence Armenian identity and identity production in this new age. So first of all, the Armenian diaspora. Most people in this room are actually part of it. I'm part of the Armenian diaspora, and it's one of the largest globally, and considering it's such a small country, it's quite impressive. We've got about 10 million members living outside of Armenia, and this diaspora isn't a new one. It's been around for about 1,700 years. One of the oldest diasporas, Armenian diasporas, is actually in Jerusalem in the Armenian Quarter. And this is just a little section from a book called Faith and History by Susan Paul Patty, saying who are the Armenians. There are a few things that they define themselves by: being the first Christian nation that really adopted Christianity, having like the alphabets, being in the Anatolian region of the world, and there's obviously much more, but this is like a small little summary. So I wanted to just go quickly into talking about collective memory as a little basis for theory. So collective memory is usually culturally constructed memory that everyone participates in. To be part of a group, you usually tend to have a history or a shared past or shared themes and identities within this group. And these identities are created through collective memory. And usually, with these shared memories, they are inherited from your parents. So you take part in institutions like Hayashen, like schools, like churches, and these memories are propagated through these structures from one generation to the next, and they're kind of immortalized, and they're a very basic part of your identity. There's obviously more to it, but this is a very basic overview. So first of all, we're talking about the genocide. This is one of the most significant events when we talk about Armenian collective memory. The Armenian genocide murdered about 1.5 million Armenians and other minorities within the region, and the systematic massacres were quite detrimental to not only the population, but in creating the diaspora. And I want to make a kind of distinction between Metzgerken, or the Great Calamity, or the way you think about the genocide, and the actual act of the genocide. The genocide is a judicial term. It's someone's committed a mass cleansing event. Metzgerken is a memory of the genocide. When you talk to elders in the community about it, they don't usually refer to it as the genocide, they refer to it as the calamity. And it's quite a defining moment in Armenian social history and memory history. And I define this as a traumatizing event, obviously. And it's considered like the birthplace of a lot of generational trauma, which is present in the Armenian community. And basically, when we contextualize the genocide in terms of the effect it's had on communities and memory, we talk about how it's annihilated cultural memory institutions. So as we said previously, these are institutions through which memory is perpetuated, through which it's continued, through which it's developed and born and passed down to further generations. And so when families are massacred, like churches, schools, homes and communities are ruined, this puts memory translation and transition into quite a risk. And also, this is, as you can see, the destruction of normative routes of transition, of collective and cultural memory. This is an identity crisis, you could say, because how are you supposed to get and build yourself a sense of identity if your family is past, if there are no Armenian communities, if no one's there to teach you Armenian, if all of these things are put into risk? And so this means that there's a shortage of communal heirs to the culture of Armenia. And this also brings about another interesting section of Armenian memory, which we're talking about more later, which is the retelling of genocide and how important that is to the Armenian community. Because when you retell the genocide, you past presence it, you bring it to the present, and therefore people modernize the memory of the genocide and keep it fresh within every new perpetuating generation. The genocide isn't something in the Armenian community's mind that happened 100 years ago, because you hear it from people who were there, you hear it from the people who are still suffering from it today. So it's modernized, it's past presence, and it therefore constitutes a seminal part of Armenian shared imagination. So when we think about being Armenian, what do you think of? You think quite often of the genocide, and unfortunately when you talk to people, you say, hello, I'm Armenian. This tends to also be one of the key things they know about Armenia. So not even internally, externally, you're also reminded of the significance of the Armenian genocide to Armenian identity. We'll be talking about how diasporas are created now, and we'll be talking specifically obviously about the Armenian diaspora, but this is quite a lot of stuff that you can also generalize to a lot of other diasporas. So basically there's a disseminating event, which is obviously in this case, as previously mentioned, the genocide, but it can be other pogroms as well, which for example Armenians and other cultures have previously undergone. And within this, there's a forced relocation, there's displacement, there's people fleeing, being murdered, and this obviously means that you, in the circumstance of Armenia, people flee to other countries in the Levant, people flee to the Western countries, which they can feel they can protect them, and this creates a cultural detachment. You leave the homeland, you leave these cultural institutions which communicate a sense of identity, and you go to a completely foreign, different culture to settle down. And if we talk about this in the backdrop of the different states the Armenian state has gone through, it's gone from Ottoman control into like control through the USSR to like an independent state. This presents a radical dislocation of everything, you know, like economically, political, socio-economically, everything changes. So the people within this time are living within a constantly changing circumstances, and it's hard to really anchor yourself and ground yourself during this time.
You carry.
Yeah, it's fine. And so basically, as an extension of this, you see a lot of times what we call generational trauma. So generational trauma is a very hard thing to actually define. It's still currently being studied as a phenomenon. But basically, when there is a traumatic event which disturbs the well-being of, let's say, a family unit, your economic state, or your like other kind of important sense of being your safety, this usually constitutes like a traumatic event which has like transgenerational consequences. So this means that you develop physical and psychological symptoms as a first-hand sufferer of a generational trauma. A lot of times when we talk about generational trauma, we talk about, we talk about mental health issues, especially from people who experience it firsthand in terms of PTSD, in terms of anxiety, in terms of depression. And we think of events like genocide as things that are suffered most acutely by people who experience it, which is true. But we don't often look at the way it affects generations, because like we said with the identity transmission, you don't just transmit identity, you also transmit the trauma. And this is actually something which has been recently proven, things like epigenetics, or the fact that your very gene expression changes when you are the victim of genocide and even your children who have not been the first-hand accounts or witnesses of this genocide also have this kind of horrible effect on them, where they are also more likely to, for example, have issues with their mental health, or have, in this case, we're talking about issues with their identity and a sense of loss. And also, when we talk about this dissemination, this scattering of people, we talk about the social, territorial, and cultural reproduction of group identity abroad, which is obviously under threat because there isn't anyone to give you structure abroad because you're not in the homeland. So this means migration, you obviously lose a sense of identity, you're moving to a new land. You obviously have small family circles, quite often times because the size of the family circle has been reduced in this traumatic event, and also because as you move abroad, you're less likely to keep contact with other members of the family. And also, quite an interesting one, hostility from the host or asylum-seeking countries. Quite a lot of countries see foreign individuals as a threat, and so they try to assimilate them in, or if they aren't assimilated, they tend to be quite hostile. And this also causes people to either hide their identity. We can talk about crypto-Christians who pretend they aren't Christians in order to be able to retain all the rights in public law. And let's say this used to be in Ottoman Empire, but in a lot of other countries as well. But this means that a lot of people hide or try to assimilate or try to reduce their public presentation of Armenian identity in order to avoid being discriminated against. And this is an interesting quote by Tunstall, but he actually defines quite a lot of Armenian identifiers as being preoccupied with the spectre of the past. And he says that this paralyzes Armenians, as in you're so preoccupied with the past, you aren't paying attention to rebuilding the identity in the future. This is obviously something we can debate later. And actually, there's quite a lot of literature that says current genocide denial, for example, by Turkey, re-traumatizes the community. How are you supposed to get away from this paralysis of the spectre of the past if there isn't any historical justice on your side? So that's obviously a large issue which can be debated. There's also Meshrop, one of the leading patriarchs of the Armenian Church, who says that identity is found not in the ashes, but in the flame it carries on. So obviously there's this issue of do not be preoccupied just with the past, but think of it as something you can carry on into the present. And we'll now talk about the movement of the diaspora. So we've talked about obviously all the pre-existing issues which occur when you're forced to become part of the diaspora, either due to economic reasons or because you're escaping persecution. Tololian, hopefully I'm pronouncing him correctly, is a brilliant diaspora theorist who talks about specifically the Armenian diaspora. He's part of it, and he calls it not dispersal, but scattering. And he argues that the diaspora settles in host countries in these encapsulated, hierarchically organized enclaves. So, for example, you can think of it as like people moving into the ghetto, or people moving into Chinatown, or people moving into the Armenian quarter. Whenever diasporas move, they tend to form these really tight-knit small communities. You could almost compare them to like shuttles in a way, where you try to keep proximity with other people in your culture, and you therefore create this ethnic kind of bubble within this host culture. The first few generations always tend to avoid assimilation. They want to sustain their collective identity, and they maintain the cultural differences between them and the host culture. They try to practice their own language as the main language. They try to keep their own schools, and they try to keep various like social and economic practices within their own community. And obviously, as they do this, they overcome new barriers to like cultural and social integration, because obviously when they come, they have to learn the culture of the new place in order to fully settle into it. And Tololian also argues that this fails after a while. After a few generations, you integrate, you assimilate, you intermix. You can't see it here, I have a little note on like how many Armenian individuals are in different places. You can talk about LA, which has over 500,000 Armenians, which is, I think, the second largest kind of like settlement outside of Armenia with the most Armenians. In Russia, there's 1 million. In the UK, there's 25,000. In, I think, London alone, there's 5,000. Canada, there's 40,000. Argentina, there's 60,000. Other areas in Latin America have about 20,000 more. But this is a huge, massive scale of diasporal dissemination. And within each of these areas, you can think of it as like a small enclave being created. And then we talk about, okay, we have these diasporas, we have people physically living in these different areas. How do you create a consciousness? How does one actually identify themselves as part of the diaspora? Living abroad doesn't mean that you're part of the diaspora. You have to identify as part of the diaspora. You have to take an active part in being a diaspora. So how do you develop this consciousness, this awareness of being part of the diaspora? And the answer is you establish it through shared community, shared imagination, shared resources, and collective memory. And I'll explain these terms a bit more specifically. So when you participate in the shared memory, fantasy, narrative, and myth, when you have shared aspects like that, which connect you and other Armenians, you can create a shared canon of concepts and references that you can then bond over with other Armenians. When, for example, I go to someone, I say, oh yes, this is what kind of food I have at home. And someone says, yes, I can reciprocate with that. There is already this unconscious bonding taking place. When we have the same narratives and myths, for example, with Haik and him resisting a Babylonian tyrant, you have a shared narrative and a shared mythology which you can look back on. And you can then start to build a shared community around that kind of historical basis. And this also happens with communicative diaspora propagation, or basically when Armenians retain things like their values, their traditions, their religious attendance, the kind of food they have, the music they have, even the shared names. You know, the Yan is such a popular identity passport almost. If you come to anyone and you say, yes, this is my surname, it has Yan at the end, people instantly tend to have this kind of connection with you because they obviously know your ethnic roots and your background, and they become attached to that and create a shared community with you over that. And so therefore you can say that the diaspora is only truly created with these shared communities and imagination and memory, like we were talking previously, and they create a shared belonging to this larger diasporic nation, despite the fact that you were globally dispersed and were so far away from the homeland. And when we talk about things specifically with Armenia, talking about imagination and shared identity, we can talk about a variety of narratives and a variety of values that you can argue most Armenians within the diaspora hold. So you talk about ethno-religious ties. Most Armenians, although not all, follow the Apostolic Armenian Church and have specific blood lineages which obviously connect them back to Armenia. When we talk about the ecclesiastical legacy of the Apostolic Armenian Church, you talk about the illuminated manuscripts, the history of Christianity, the Sharagan's hymns. You talk about how oftentimes the Christian religion functions as a birth certificate for a lot of Armenians, being like, maybe I'm not connected to the Armenian culture that much, but I do go to the church down the road, which is an Armenian apostolic church. And as previously said, another large aspect which connects a lot of Armenians is this genocide remembrance. We kind of recreate historical and cultural narratives around massive violence together. Everyone has a story where an elder of theirs has told them about their experiences in the genocide, and it functions as a key pillar of unity within the Armenian population. It leaves this trail of collective memories connecting current generations with a different time in a different time and place, which allows this kind of shared propagation of social memory regarding shared ancestry. And then when we talk about this on a larger scale, and I'll go more into mechanizing how this happens on a practical scale later, we talk about how transnational identity becomes a larger concept. A lot of people have this exilic nationalism. Basically, I'm an exile from my nation. I'm an exile from Armenia. And this was quite a strong attitude up until the 1970s. You're a nomad who's been rejected from their home country. You can't settle. And so you've obviously got this attitude of repatriation. One day an aim is to return back to the country. This is quite a strong narrative about 1970s, upon which it was replaced by this sense of diasporic transnationalism. People became more comfortable living in their countries of settlement. They still retained their Armenianness through a sense of diaspora and community, and they no longer thought it was necessary to be able to go home in order to reclaim their Armenianness. And as dispersed diasporic groups retain their connections with their kin in the homeland and in other scattered communities, you develop this global sense of connection, this global diaspora. And key part of this, which we'll be going into, is actually building up a more organized, institutionalized way to connect all these communities together. Another thing I'll quickly mention, which I thought was very important, but which I know a lot of people sometimes disagree with, even within the community, is how another one of the focal aspects and narratives around being Armenian is having the other. So if you were to theorize about it, what do Armenians see as the other? And an obvious answer is the Turks, the Ottomans, this pan-Turkic threat, this existential threat towards our existence. And you can obviously trace it back to like Ottomanization, you can trace it back to the genocide, but this actually creates this kind of primordial enemy within like Armenian literature and memory, this kind of huge threat which is looming against you. And this is present obviously in the cultural erasure aims of the Ottomans and the Turks, if you would interpret it as such. About 240,000 Armenians following in 1923 disappeared, you could say, off the Armenian census maps. They were put into bondage, they were converted, they disappeared effectively from this Armenian understanding of identity. And so there's this huge scare about this kind of the other, the Ottoman, the Turk, and now the Azerbaijani. And it actually helps, in a weird way, perpetuate this sense of Armenianness. If you've got an enemy, you're more likely to define yourself against them. And when you define yourself against this other, you're more likely to be like, okay, my actions in perpetuating Armenian diaspora and Armenian identity have this huge, larger aim. We're fighting against this huge enemy. We're the underdog. We're Haik. And this is the Babylonian tyrant, for example, to use that metaphor. And so there's this renewed need to keep Armenian identity and preserve it for future generations. And then when we talk about, okay, but how do we do that? How do you functionally translate this urge and this need and this fear of being culturally raised when you don't have anyone to bond with over? You don't have a homeland. You're, in a lot of cases, a foreigner, let's say first generation, living in a host country that you can't really connect with. And what we do, I think, very well in terms of diaspora and also as like a community is what's called symbolic territorialization. So basically, territorialization is the act of organizing as a territory. And usually this means you have land to go on. Obviously, as a diaspora, you don't have the land. So what you do is you instead go through symbolic territorialization. So you go through the motions of organizing as a territory without having any actual land to organize on. And obviously transnational communities are isolated. They have, in a lot of terms, really hard time sustaining cultural links with the homeland and with people they're close to and other diaspora groups which are in the Armenian kind of sphere. But what you then do instead is you re-territorialize Armenian imagination. You create a sense of imagination which, it doesn't matter what land you're in, you still share in this certain slice of Armenian identity, therefore making it a whole. And so communities are made into a geopolitical reality and symbolically territorialized by creating a territorial and cultural reproduction of Armenian identity abroad. You create your identity being based around being abroad instead of being based around being an exile or a nomad. And oftentimes this can be seen in ways you refer to yourself as, or not yourself, but Armenia as the motherland. It's Hayashen. You know, this is a native word for a geographical place, which isn't the word that's usually, like, people call it Armenians, or Armenia, and Armenians often call it Hayashen. This kind of personal connection, this kind of building of this own lingo, this own small inside language, helps quite a lot with marrying the myth and the territory together. And what I mean by that is you start romanticizing the notion of homeland with other Armenians, with other exiled people, and you create the sense of homeland that exists in your memory, in your mind. You imagine a homeland for yourself. And you can talk about the famous poet, writer, I should remember his name, Saurian, where he argues that, this is often a quote that's, I think, argued against a new Armenia, where if two Armenians meet in a bar over a drink, it doesn't matter where they are, it doesn't matter how far ago their roots are from, they create a new Armenia when they meet. And obviously, I've done my research, this quote is misattributed, but he still, in his paper, has an interesting talk about how, like, regardless of the location, your birthplace, when you speak Armenian with another Armenian, you make a new, like, very bold statement against your history. You say, we've survived, we've created a new circle for ourselves. And therefore, this metaphysical notion of homeland outside of physical homeland is created. This is a very interesting quote by Ivan Papian, this Armenian diplomat, where Armenians are not place-bound. We're not tied to a place, but we are intensely place-conscious. You're very aware about where you are and what place you inhabit, but you're not tied to it, you're not obsessed with it. And basically, when you create this physical, like, apart from physical territorial entity, when you create this imagined territorialization, you create a transnational conception of Armenia, which allows the diaspora to still organize themselves as if they were a nation. And obviously, as we talk through the shared memories, quite a lot of shared narratives that occur across this transnational kind of ethnographic dispersion is obviously this motif of survivors, this thing of we're martyrs and we've survived and we are now unsettled nomads. You create obviously this kind of concept of imagining the homeland through symbolic motifs, through Ararat, through pomegranates, through the highlands, through the duduk music, and you think about that stuff, and it creates this kind of like symbolic image of Armenia through these shared narratives, obviously. And I would show you the pictures, but unfortunately they aren't coming up. But I'll talk you through some of the artistic narratives and motifs that occur quite a lot in diasporic work, and how they kind of connect with this conception of like a shared diaspora narrative. So I'll run you through the motifs and I'll try my best to explain maybe some of the pictures. I'm sure some of you will know some of the artists that I'm going to be talking about. So basically, when we talk about art, art can become a vehicle for preserving not just a family's memory, but the memory of an entire people. And we talk about famous motifs that you might think show up in Armenian work. You're talking about Armenian national identity, you talk about their temperament, you talk about themes of displacement, themes of the road, the pole, empty space. You talk about pomegranates representing fertility, blood, survival. You talk about traditional food and drink. And I would argue there's two ways you present this. Either in this like frugal, simplistic way, talking back to the domestic roots, or you talk about it in like ancient opulence, you know, the kind of like the kingdom of Van. You talk about this ancient kind of opulence that Armenia used to have. And you also emphasize scenes of Armenian scenic bliss or traditional domestic activities, so cooking or weaving. I will now attempt to explain the pictures. So first of all is Prayanov. So we talk about my father's bizarre and funny life, and there's a clip from the movie called The Color of Pomegranates, or The Color of the Pomegranates, which I'm sure people can understand in its significance. Prayanov was an amazing Armenian director, an Armenian born in Tbilisi, and quite a lot of his work centers around Ukraine, and he defines himself as someone, like I said, born in Tbilisi, made himself in Ukraine, and then was imprisoned in a Russian prison for his attitude towards Ukrainian nationalism and independence. And then you've also got Gorky, you've got Hakobian, you've got Aslamazyan. Hopefully some of the pictures will be able to come up in a second. But a lot of these themes have these kind of like pulses of Armenians flowing through them. And it would be much easier to explain it over picture, but if there's no chance, then that's fine. So I'll talk you through some of the things. We've obviously got my father's bizarre and funny life. We've got Aveshtian, we've got baking lavash. So you've got this kind of ancient looking picture, slightly degraded, of a woman baking lavash. You've got Hakobian, you've got a woman frying fish. These are like very classical Armenian artists and representations. You've got Aslan Mazyan, this famous you really focus on Armenian diaspora in the Soviet Union, and this is a picture of a woman weaving a picture of Stalin, and it's beautifully rendered in these gorgeous red colours. And next to you, you've got Gorky, you've got the artist and his mother, which has this beautiful simplistic style, which has also these very haunting looks in their eyes, and obviously you can make the comparison to this kind of ancestral connection. You've also got another one by Gorky, which is, I think, the red cock and the comb, which is this kind of surrealist, like, dazzlement. Hakobian, which very interesting themes he provokes, because when you search into Hakobian, born in Egypt, he was repatriated after a while, became like a national artist of Armenia. He's on all the little stamps. There's a kind of special meaning to a lot of his work. He has these very empty spaces, this kind of lack of space almost. And I think it's quite reminiscent of like the Armenian journey, the Armenian exodus. It's the empty road, it's the crossroads. And here you've got a teeny tiny picture of Sarian. I think this one is called The Spell of the Sun. And Sarian, this is a quote from him, used to listen to my parents' stories about our mountains, enchanted country. Used to run as a small boy around the land of our home and was filled with joy at the many colours of the butterflies, the insects, the flowers, the colour, the light and the daydreaming. These are what fired me. And he's got a string of arts which he calls My Homeland, which are these beautiful golden depictions of Armenia and its scenery. And another bit on Gorky, talking about how relevant to the memory theme we're talking about, he talks and paints under the concept of a time of return. He says that he doesn't want to keep these memories just only in his mind. He wants to have a material version which he can kind of put himself through, he can immerse himself through. And so he creates these kind of like also gorgeous pictures of kind of his conceptions of Armenia. And there's also Sarkis Ordian, this tiny Ukrainian picture over there, where he's called the Lonely Painter. He's born in Ukraine, never repatriated, I think. And if you see, he's got the classical themes, he's got this kind of like beautiful, like red, like pomegranates with this stripe in the air, and the stripe, my personal interpretation, I'm sure a lot of interpretations are the same, kind of represents the stripe on the Armenian flag of living under peaceful skies as like one of the hopes of the Armenian nation. And so yeah, that's one of the kind of artistic themes. Another one with the Hakobian, which is I think called Sorrow, which is this kind of emaciated man looking down. I'll see if I can, yeah, it's not coming up on mine either way. I guess it'll work for my notes. But yeah, and so when we kind of take these narratives as this holistic basis, we think of like the themes, the motifs, the images that are stimulated when you think of Armenian identity. And I want you to take that and I want you to set it aside. Hard to do, but when we're talking about organising these motifs, obviously everyone can have this romantic attachment to Armenia, but how do you actually organise in a practical and mechanistic sense a basis to appreciate and share with your interpretations and narratives about being Armenian? And the way we do it is talking about the mobilisation of the diaspora. How do we organise it? How do we structure it? How is it formed? We talked about how it's formed in the shared imagination, but how is it formed in terms of organisational structure? And we do this by talking about diaspora organisations, of which Hayashen is a very good example. With shared proximity to an area, people obviously spontaneously start rebuilding institutions, Armenian schools, Armenian churches, through which they can organise. You create these community centres, and you attempt to preserve your religious and nationalistic rituals. And this maintains the shared cultural and linguistic and historical links, not only between you and a fellow Armenian, but also between you and the homeland. And these historical links and practices allow you to connect locally and transnationally, and it institutionalizes. This is something key. This is something which we lost in the Armenian genocide. We lost these institutional ways to carry on cultural transmission. We now rebuild them in the diaspora. You re-institutionalize identity transmission. And the key role of diaspora organizations, when we talk about creating this link between fellow Armenians, is that it functions as an intermediary. An organization is useless without its people, but it still forms a specific role. It's a nexus through which you can interconnect smaller communities. You build up these organized, institutionalized, interdiasporic ways of connecting, and through organizations, we can use Hayashen as an example. We can use the American Institute for Armenian diaspora members as an example. We build new structures, cultural institutions, and collective ways of organizing, which allows you to create these social spaces. And as we build up these kind of organizations from grassroots to larger, more official organizations, you can actually create what's called diasporic civil society abroad. And basically, when you start amalgamating grassroots organizations through, the Ministry of Armenian Assembly of Armenia, through Hayashen, to these larger, very well-functioning units, you start getting the attention of the homeland. You start creating a ministry of the Armenian diaspora. And what's so key about this is that as you build access to national representatives, as you build diplomatic cooperation with the Armenian government, you entrench the concept of the diaspora as a geopolitical reality. You're no longer people just organizing to talk about your shared community memories. You're now an internationally recognized community. You now have some political sway. You have economic power that you can transfer through certain lines, and you can build up the stateless diaspora to now a state-linked diaspora. If you've got the attention of an entire country, if you've got the attention of Armenia, and they have a specific ministry for you, it makes you have a certain new geopolitical value when we talk about the geopolitics of the region and the power of the diaspora abroad. And a lot of ways you can do this, for example, is fostering self-identity through long-distance nationalism. You can directly support and finance the homeland, and in fact that's what a lot of Armenians do with remittances. And we talk about, in this case, when you become state-linked, triadic relations, which are basically relations between the diaspora and the homeland, or the real and imagined concept of the homeland. So you've got three aspects to this. You've got the diaspora, you've got the imagined concept of homeland, and you've got the actual homeland, in this case Armenia. And a lot of people say that a diaspora only truly becomes a significant entity when they get obviously connected to the state through these triadic connections, which again is something we can argue against, so we can discuss later. But let's go into the specifics of what use the diaspora has potentially for the homeland. And in fact, should the diaspora even need to be connected to the homeland in order to function as their own entity? This is an interesting quote by Tansel, pretend it's on the screen. Aiding the frail and infant independent Armenian Republic became a paramount ethno-national cause among the diaspora communities, and contacts between Armenia and diaspora slowly increased and deepened. So, do diaspora Armenians have a role and responsibility in rebuilding this homeland? Or, in fact, state building? This is a new country at this point, after all these this history of being ruled over. How are you supporting the infant Armenia? Is this something you should do as someone who's been disconnected from the homeland for quite a while? And in fact, how does this actually occur? So you can talk about the political reconnection with the homeland. A lot of Armenians internationally rallied to get the Armenian genocide recognized. This is something which has happened with Joe Biden most recently. They lobby their governments for pro-Armenian policy and legislation. So let's say better foreign policy with Armenia, let's say increased aid with Armenia. The diaspora organizations have quite a strong social voice now in voting in people or giving their democratic support to candidates who say they will prioritize Armenian interests abroad. And you can also do this through economic methods. So when you go to Armenia as a tourist, for example, when you contribute through philanthropy, when you contribute through remittances, which in 2007 formulated almost 20% of the Armenian GDP, which is absolutely massive. As these Armenians are settling in these new countries, they're creating these new educational links and business links with each other. They're becoming a diasporic elite. They're gaining new social power and access to new social power, which they didn't have previously. And this is a very attractive prospect for Armenia, because these people are a wealth of knowledge and information which could be used to contribute to the Armenian economy. And oftentimes this is done through things like foreign investments or startup models. There's the Nerush program, which attracts young Armenian entrepreneurs from far away to Armenia to help contribute to Armenian education systems. And Tolstoyan explains it as the Armenian diaspora desperately wants to turn towards the homeland and contributing to it by intervening in its politics and culture and drawing from it. And he says this is anything new from songs to spouses to cheap labor. So you've got this kind of urge to reconnect in many, many capacities. And this brings us into a very interesting conversation about what's the end goal of this. Armenians obviously want to be proximate to their homeland, and the state sees this as something they can take advantage of to rebuild Armenia to new heights. But do Armenians truly want to end their exile? There's this huge narrative of repatriation, of return, of being able to go back home and reintegrate the diaspora back into the local population. And this is done with a huge emphasis on this is my birthright, I've been robbed of it, and now I can reclaim it. And I would argue this is quite a popular thing. This is, for example, Jewish people in Israel have the similar kind of nation, although obviously it's different. But then we start talking about, is this actually possible? I think there's a huge gap in this repatriation narrative which hasn't been properly addressed by the Armenian nation. This is another quote which the Tashkanushtuyan acted like many returning exiles who think they could step back into a homeland they have idealized, not realizing that it is in fact being entirely transformed between 1921 and 1988. Returning exiles often do not realize the extent to which they are perceived as idealized ghosts of the past, as outsiders, who cannot become serious players in the local game without first transforming themselves. And what this quote means is that oftentimes people have this idealized, romanticized notion of Armenia returning to the homeland and being able to rebuild this impoverished nation. But when they actually go there, they see that this is a truly impoverished nation with many corrupt officials, many bureaucratic processes, and a lack of understanding of the complexity of the diaspora, and indeed that the diaspora wants to be true Armenians. There is a bit of this tension, this cognitive dissonance existing. When the initial kind of waves of individuals and organizations repatriating to Armenia occurred, I think there was this mockery of even the dialect. They used to call them, and they might even mock my accent, akbars, which is like a mockery of saying brother, which is basically making fun of the Eastern dialect and the Western dialect of Armenia, and the attempt to kind of have these diaspora people reintegrate without properly knowing the language. And this is also an issue when you talk about how obviously the state now has an obsession with this diaspora as this source of a new creative energy, and oftentimes they actually prefer the diaspora to local Armenians, which creates a bit of tension in that aspect. And so when we have to tackle this concept of narratives of Armenia, and in fact Armenia and its role in the Armenians and its role in the Armenian state, you have to tackle this reality. And unless this reality is actually talked about and settled, I don't think there can be large-scale successful repatriation. This obviously is just another personal opinion, and I welcome any, during the question things, any arguments against it. And now I want to talk about something which I would argue is one of the more significant, at least personally significant aspects of this talk, which is Armenian identity and new generations of Armenian identity. Assimilation is obviously seen as a huge threat to the Armenian community. They don't want to see Armenians being decultured. They don't want to see them lose their language. They don't want to see them intermarry and lose grasp of their cultural values and dilution of Armenianness. And Tolstoyan, once again, one of my favorites, diaspora kind of researchers, argues about the creation of composites. Sounds quite scientific. What are these composites? These composites, he argues, bear Armenian names but are in fact assimilated. They have a symbolic Armenian identity, but they manifest minimum commitment to symbolic institutions and functions. So this could be shown as symbolically, similar to me, for example, I go to the Armenian church during Easter and wear the veil once a year, maybe. But outside of that, I don't necessarily really communicate that much with the Armenian community. And I felt quite called out by this, obviously. I said, I'm not composite. I may not be as Armenian as many other people, but I would just not like to be reduced to such a label, even though it obviously called out to me in a certain way. And so I'd like to kind of pose this kind of larger question, which we can keep in our minds and talk about later in the question section. But do we want to critique this interpretation of Armenian identity? In Faith and History, there's an interesting statement that says the source of the pain for the Armenian community is this new reopening wound, which is the current loss of Armenian identity in the cultural world, which is unalleviated. It's no longer the genocide is causing the cultural loss of Armenians. It's the current loss of Armenianness within these new settled societies, which the author of this book argues is the new source of pain, this kind of wound which won't close. And so when we talk about the conceptions of being Armenian and feeling Armenian, we have to actually come face to face with the fact there are a lot of new generations of Armenians who either don't feel Armenian or don't feel like they're connected to the Armenian community for a variety of reasons. And to kind of preface talking about, I've talked to some Armenian friends, I did a little ethnographic study, I saw what they thought about being Armenian, and to kind of preface this, I want to ask these kind of rhetorical questions. Does an Armenian cease to be an Armenian when they leave Armenia? And I would say, obviously not. You are Armenian, you practice being Armenian, you are perceived as an Armenian, you have your Armenian identity, regardless of whether you are or are not in Armenia. Otherwise, every time a plane leaves Armenia, you'd lose an amount of the population or something. And now there's a bit of a harder question. Can Armenians ever lose their identity? Obviously, you can talk about forceful conversion, you can talk about how Armenian identity is hidden, but can you lose this identity accidentally? Can you lose this identity through neglect? Is Armenian identity something that has to be practiced, or is it innate to yourself? And this is a bit of a clip of the author's perspective in Faith and History. I'll not only read out a small amount because it's not on the board. Because I was born and raised in America, the product of a mixed marriage, a Protestant, and only just learning Armenian, many people were not too shy to tell me I was the personification of the sad future in store for the Armenian nation: assimilation, westernization. But as work continued and it appeared I might be serious, the attitude mellowed considerably, and people often praised my mother for me having raised her children to be aware of being Armenian. It was difficult to explain that she had not consciously tried to do this. And that's obviously what the author thinks, who's a mixed Armenian. But then when we talk about conceptions of Armenianness, we have to do it in the sense of there are now the undeniable reality that there are mixed Armenians. I myself am one of them. My mum's Polish, my dad's Armenian. There's also the effects of globalization and this new called digital diaspora. There's a rise of, I would argue, a globalized Armenian identity. There's a mixed and third generation Armenians which identify as transnationals. These Armenians occupy a third space between the country of origin, Armenia, and the country of settlement. And I would like to specifically make a distinction. These are not host countries, these are countries of settlement. So you aren't a foreigner. This isn't a liminal space which diasporas often take where they are neither from here nor here. They aren't foreigners, they have settled. And these are increasingly heterogeneous and young populations. which tend to reject actually collective and familial identity and communal norms, which actually puts quite a lot of this presentation into question. These are new independent Armenians which conceive of their identity as being agentic, being voluntary. They associate with who they want. They don't get their sense of identity necessarily from their parents or their community. And Faith and History says this as well. Young people are selective and busy. They're ambitious and aimed towards the future. They aren't obsessed with the past and remembering the genocide the same way you could argue previous generations were. And these identities are no longer exclusively ethnically constructed, and in fact they have this dynamic conceptualization of identity. They value symbolism and emotions to selfhood, and they oftentimes aren't religious. So that's another aspect of like diaspora identity narratives which you could consider kind of losing significance. And these hybridized identities, these regional intrastate identities, I think are best captured in the rise of these merged home cultures and settled cultures. So you talk about merging Armenian identity and customs, food, with the culture of a new place, with food, music, customs, and values of other settler cultures. And this can be seen in British Armenian identities, in Russian Armenian identities, Lebanese Armenian, Syrian Armenian. All of these mixed Armenian identities can be seen as the new rise of a new generation and conception of Armenian identity. Another quote from Faith and History. Someone said that the Cypriot Armenian community is like a witch's brew. The people are from everywhere, and they're trying to extend their roots here. Look at me. Half my family is in Hayashen, and half is in America. And so when you talk about accessing Armenian identity and talking about this new Armenian identity, which identifies away from traditional parental state and elite authorities or givers of identity, they don't get their identity from this Armenian state they consider quite far to them and not in touch with their needs. They don't necessarily take their identity from their parents because their parents obviously are mixed or maybe aren't really in touch with their Armenian identity or pushers of Armenian identity. And obviously there's this also technological aspect. You don't need to get identity from these small organized diaspora centers anymore when you can have independent connections with the homeland or across huge like swaths of land digitally. And so when you talk about this, another issue I think comes to mind, which is how do you access this Armenian identity? If there's so many new segments and fractals and smaller building blocks of Armenian identity, people identifying differently, a lot of people say, well, actually, the good way to sense whether or not you're truly Armenian, whether you're different from these composites, although Totayan will, as I say later, agree with me to a certain extent, is language, you know, Pan-Armenianism. If you know the language, if you know how to say Barevich, Pesas, then you are Armenian. But is it really the language, or does the language represent, and the importance of language represent, the capacity to transmit Armenianness? Do we think that you can only transmit being Armenian if you transmit it through the language? And I think this provokes an interesting topic and conversation about identity and language, as many new mixed generations, myself included, of Armenians, don't actually speak the language for a variety of reasons, obviously. You could say it's successful cultural erasure. You can talk about lack of time of new immigrants. And another subject, which is your parent, your Armenian parent, a woman or not? Because women are oftentimes conceived as the gatekeepers to Armenian culture. So you're actually more likely to keep speaking Armenian or speaking your home language if it's a mother transmitting it, because women, like I said, are gatekeepers of a lot of cultures. And this is another quote from Faith and History, which is, Mr. Shantz taught me my Armenian, not just the language, but he taught me what it is to really be Armenian. And so this made me think for a second. I've obviously never felt like I was fully, truly Armenian. I don't speak the language. Many conversations just go over my head. When someone calls me Akchi, I know what they're talking about, but otherwise I have no clue. And so it kind of probes this question, is it location, blood, and awareness of being Armenian or not? What really shapes being Armenian? And I was confused for a bit. I was like, okay, I'm aware there's new generations of Armenians, and there is this diaspora awareness of new generations of Armenians who will keep on assimilating or building into these new settled countries because of, as we said, this repatriation myth, this gap in repatriation. They're not going to go moving to Armenia. And because of that, I wanted to talk to some Armenians about it, some diaspora Armenians of my age and preferably my kind of background, who I could talk to about this. And I got some very interesting results, which I'd like to share with you. One of them was born in Armenia. He's a student, member of the student diaspora, so he's been in the UK for 8 years. And he says that he sometimes feels like he loses connection with his culture, but it's fine because he revives it whenever he goes back to visit Armenia, visit his family, visit his birthplace. So this is a classic example of first kind of generation almost. He's born in Armenia, fully like Armenian parents, but he lives abroad. And we'll talk about what they said when I asked them how Artsakh affected their identity later. So this is kind of classic. This is very interesting person, very nice. This is another kind of more different perspective. This is a member of the community who was born in London, also goes to Edinburgh, so he kind of straddles the diasporas between these two capitals. But he says, my Armenian identity is not necessarily being challenged, but constructed by globalization. Globalization is a seminal part in building it. It's not a barrier to it. He says that he is Armenian, he's 2 Armenian parents, but he says that he's filled with the food of many different types of diasporas, from Iran, Turkey, Cyprus, Egypt, and he is an Armenian in a way that is recognizably and materially different to Armenian nationals, but he's distinctly still Armenian. My identity is constructed by globalization, transnationalism, assimilation. It is nevertheless Armenian. He wrote in a very nice way, very poetical. And he says he's distinctly British Armenian, and he dislikes this kind of talk about what is a true Armenian, which he kind of labels as like unnecessarily diviceful, I would say. And he says that his Armenian identity is deeply rooted in notions of culture and land. Land is important, but it's the connection to the people, he argues, which is more important indicator of his Armenian identity. And his Armenian identity is an amalgamation of where we have been, what we have done, what has been done to us, and more importantly, what we have made. And I think this posits the rise of a new generation of Armenians by choice. People who, if they identify Armenian due to their connections with Armenia, have to a certain degree a right to call themselves Armenian. And as I said, we can have a discussion about this afterwards, because I know there might be disagreement or different interpretations of it. And I would argue actually this new iteration of Armenian identity helps the survival of Armenians abroad, because these hybridized identities, people who may be ethnically mixed, born in different cultures, not really follow the cultural values of Armenia, still identify as Armenian, and therefore they might be more resistant to geopolitical changes and acculturation to dominant societies. Previously, understandings of identity was like, if you're ethnically dominated by one side, you are that side. But here, no matter how distant your relation to Armenian blood is, if you consciously say that you're Armenian and attempt to practice it, you're able to keep Armenian identity alive away from assimilation. And Tolstoyan, thank God, agrees with me to a certain degree on this, where he actually says there are Armenians in this new generation who, you can still call them composites, but they actually try their best to participate in diaspora organizations, and this kind of real or imagined community within successful diasporas, which Armenian diaspora is obviously a successful one. They fashion a new real imagined community, which we've talked about through territorialization, which we've talked about through diaspora organizations, through shared community, and they create boundaries porous between themselves and their host society. So it's an intermixing. It's not just Armenian diaspora is overwhelmed by the host society, means the host society has been influenced by Armenian identity as well. It's reciprocal, it's not just a one-way route. And you can see this by, let's say, the emerging significance of like Armenian political issues in the media, or let's say the spread of Armenian culture and food, or indeed intermixing. And this kind of new Armenians and hybridized identities, I think, are a very interesting topic. And now just for the last section, because I'm aware that time is running slowly, and I'd love to hear some of your opinions on this. Artsakh, very, very important issue, I think, in modern Armenian diaspora and identity. So, as I'm sure we know about Nagorno-Karabach, it's an enclave, an exclave within modern-day Azerbaijan, and it's at this point in time, it's going to be merged back in with Azerbaijan. Its identity as an autonomous oblast is over. And I want to talk about the significance of Artsakh to Armenian identity, and also new, almost, of this pan-Turkic community. You can see how this historical attitude of survivors merged with this fear of the other, and merged with what's currently going on in terms of the blockade of the humanitarian corridor, in terms of bombing and destruction of infrastructure and the death of civilians. You can see how this, also including a lot of genocidal rhetoric from, let's say, Erdogan, creates this new fear of genocide. This historical enmity and this existential threat, argued by, understood through the diaspora's collective memory of genocide and victimhood, and their fear of another genocide, I think, has created a new identitarian push within the Armenian diaspora. More people are adopting Artsakh as a symbol of the enduring Armenian spirit and resistance, and they see fighting for it as symbolic for fighting for Armenian historical survival and justice and culture. And so I think, actually, similar to the fragmentation that occurred after genocide, we'll have another moment of fracturing with this new kind of generation of Karabakh Armenians migrating to Armenia following the destruction of their homes. This is going to, I think, contribute to new historic narratives of cultural uprootment and destruction and displacement. And this new generation of first-hand victims, I think, will kind of parallel prior collective narratives of Armenian displacement and victimhood. And this is something I also saw reflected in this ethnographic interviews I talked to about. The first person I talked to about says, yes, it's made me become closer to home. It's made me become closer to the nation state. For obvious reasons, he feels more of a reason to stand with Armenia as he sees what he effectively conceives as his brothers, having this horrible thing done to them. The second speaker, person I talked to, also had a very interesting perspective, because they said it developed my feelings towards the nation state into my identity, but also led me to challenge many underlying assumptions of victimhood. He talked about the Armenians in Artsakh are victims of ethnic cleansing, but it also must be said of the Azeri populations, which were in turn cleansed during the war. So you can perceive Azerbaijan as the other and the belligerent kind of neighbor, but also you have to see the kind of mutual history of cultural cleansing also done to Azerbaijan by the Armenian authorities during certain periods of history. And there is this kind of need to become closer to Artsakh, obviously, but there's also Artsakh as an exposing incompetence in the state, exposing corruption in the state. Many diaspora Armenians are actually becoming, the triadic relations we were talking about earlier, they're becoming more distant from the state, because they see Artsakh as a geopolitical and foreign policy failure on the side of the Armenian government. And so this is creating, I think, this huge new issue where there is at the same time this diaspora coming to closer because they're creating this pan-Armenian attitude. They're rallying around Artsakh as a symbol of Armenian survival. They're desperately, in their opinion, fighting for the stop of another cultural erasure event. But also, it's distanced them from the homeland in terms of the state. They dislike the politics. They're now closer to each other as diaspora members who rally, for example, for attack in front of embassies or something, as opposed to liking the current government. And I think this is an interesting crossroads for Armenian identity, where we've talked about this huge historical cultural legacy of how diasporas form, how identities form in these diasporas, how you have these huge narratives collected at the homeland. But here is a huge split with the homeland that's been this idealized center of the diaspora for many, many generations. And it was already decentralized when Armenian identity become more focused on like the diaspora instead of the homeland. This is another important event, I think, which will define it. And I wanted to not leave you on this kind of weird kind of limbo note of this is like a huge issue. I wanted to instead give you a little passage from Reverend Father Meshrop Parsamia, who is the Reverend of the Armenian Apostolic Church. And he says, however, the secret to this continuous survival of Armenians is the knowledge of our history. When you embrace your past, you become part of the future. When Kartanasi of the 5th century wrote the history of Armenians, he put together a chronicle to be passed down to future generations. This too embodies the Armenian dream, the Armenian vision, the Armenian way. So, if we continue to embrace the past, we can create a future based on a history that can remain relevant across the ages. And I think that's one of the most important things we can talk about when talking about the Armenian community's genocide, when we talk about the generational trauma, when we talk about the current issues we still have to face as people who can sometimes go through this kind of schizophrenic experiencing of identity. Where are we from originally? Where do we belong? And I think his words have a lot of hope when you talk to that, because it's not necessarily being stuck in the past, being stuck in the ashes. It's being able to recognize how far we have come as a culture and how far we can remain relevant, we can remain strong and attached to our roots and not be lost in this kind of identitarian or like traumatic crisis by working towards the future together as a diaspora. And yeah, that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I wanted to open up on this kind of subject of identity, of how you think generational trauma still affects our communities, because I think the othering is a sign of generational trauma too. I think when you are so obsessed around the past and living in the past instead of working towards the future, you tend to fall into the trap of automatically othering. And obviously the geopolitical consequences of that in terms of bilateral relations are horrific, but there are others too.